In the book of Deuteronomy, God tells the people, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. But there's at least one guy who says, no thanks. A professor at Clemson University says human extinction would be sad, but might improve life on Earth. Humans should just lie down and die and make things better. In a rambling and poorly reasoned op-ed in the New York Times, a former newspaper, this Monday, Professor Todd May suggested it might be sad but not bad if future generations of humanity simply weren't born in order, of course, to save the Earth. Now, that a stupid opinion should appear on Monday in the New York Times simply proves that it was Monday in the New York Times. But the particular babbling chain of thought involved in Professor Todd May's death-loving reasoning exemplifies almost every trend of philosophical thought on the left, from the love of transgenderism to the subjugation of art to politics, and a very weird but telling practice called Kafka trapping. All right, I got to take a look at this article. I know it's been around. People have been talking about it, but I've been waiting to talk about it, and this is the first time I've really had a chance. This is an article that was said, would the extinction of humanity be a tragedy? And he dithers around a lot about what he means by tragedy and the fact that it would be our fault. But here's basically, let me read you the two sections that says what he has to say, and then I want to talk about why this reasoning is central to the right. And it links up with another very important article that came out in Quillette. He says, let me start with a claim that I think will be at once depressing and, upon reflection, uncontroversial. Human beings are destroying large parts of the inhabitable earth and causing unimaginable suffering to many of the animals that inhabit it. This is happening through at least three means. First, human contribution to climate change is devastating ecosystems, as the recent article on Yellowstone Park in the New York Times exemplifies. Second, increasing human population is encroaching on ecosystems that would otherwise be intact. And third, factory farming fosters the creation of millions upon millions of animals for whom it offers nothing but suffering and misery before slaughtering them in often barbaric ways, but cooking them in very tasty ways, I should add. There is no reason to think that those practices are going to go away anytime soon. Quite the opposite. Humanity, then, is the source of devastation of the lives of conscious animals on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Now, a lot of these environmental problems, of course, would be solved if the professor just stopped reading the New York Times. The New York Times, which is where most of the problems exist. You know, I mean, we do make a mess of things before we clean things up. Human beings do make messes before we clean them up. We created the London fog. You may, if you've read about that in books, there was a London fog that you could, pea souper, they used to call it, that you couldn't see through. They got alternate forms of heating rather than coal, and the London fog went away. LA used to have a green smog that would roll in, all that, and make it very, very difficult to breathe. Catalytic converters solved that. Human problems are very often solved by human beings inventing new stuff. I would guess that we are not far away from ways of storing solar energy and wind energy that will make those forms of energy useful as they are not right now. All right. But he is dealing with the torment that is inflicted on animals by the mass creation of food, you know. And by the way, let me just say that while I want to solve this problem last, after I solve the problems of human beings, I mean, as long as a child is suffering on Earth, I care about this much more than a goat. But I do believe we could treat animals better. I will say that. I think animals could be treated better. More important that we eat and love and laugh and be merry than that we do that. But I do think that it is something on the list of things that we are going to have to do, that we're going to want to do eventually. But he says, nope, there is just too much torment wreaked upon too many animals and too certain a prospect that this is going to continue and probably increase. It would overwhelm anything we might place on the other side of the ledger. Our own science is revealing the richness of the lives of our fellow creatures, that they have consciousness and have complex emotional relationships with each other. And this ironically gives us a reason to eliminate our own continued existence. In other words, because we are harming other conscious creatures, we should eliminate our existence. Now, he says, one might ask here whether, given this view, it would also be a good thing for those of us who are currently here to end our lives in order to prevent further animal suffering. Should we kill ourselves? Although I do not have a final answer to this question, he says, I guess we can all count ourselves lucky. Otherwise, we might open the door and Professor Todd May would be outside with an axe. But he says, I do not have a final answer to this question. We should recognize that the case of future humans is very different from the case of currently existing humans. I love the New York. I read the New York Times every morning just for the satire. It says, to demand of currently existing humans that they should end their lives would introduce significant suffering among those who have much to lose by dying. In contrast, preventing future humans from existing does not introduce such suffering, since those human beings will not exist and therefore not have lives to sacrifice. The two situations are not analogous. This guy is like a cartoon character in some takeoff on academics, but here he is in the New York Times. He says, it well may be then that the extinction of humanity would make the world better off, and yet would be a tragedy. It's a tragedy because it's our own fault. See, our tragic flaw was that we are doing these terrible things. I don't want to say this for sure, he says, since the issue is quite complex. It's quite complex whether we should all die or not. But it certainly seems a live possibility, and that by itself disturbs me. Again, the fact that the New York Times is running comically stupid philosophical op-eds is not news, right? It's the New York Times. It's the op-ed page. It's knucklehead row, that there's another knucklehead involved. It should not surprise us. But it's important because of the way he's thinking and why he's wrong. And in the middle of this article, he kind of flirts with some of the reasons why he's wrong, and he dithers about them for a while. But here's the thing, okay? Every value that he's talking about is a human value and would cease to exist without humans to notice it. The idea that consciousness is a good and suffering is a bad is a human value. The value of other people's, of other consciousness, of animals' consciousness is a human value. The lion that rips the throat out of the antelope does not give a crap about the antelope's consciousness. That, to value another creature's consciousness, is a human value. No humans, no value. We give that value. We bring that value with us. This is why God had Adam name the animals, because we create those values, because we can put them into words, and in words we can explore their meaning and create values. Just to know consciousness, just to want consciousness, just to avoid a truck coming at you is not giving value to something or giving meaning to something. You have to have language to do that. So when you say, would it be good for us to die? The question is, good for whom? If we weren't there, the goodness of our dying would be erased, right? Any good that would come of our dying would be there. Good and evil, human values, things that we see on earth, that we create and we understand. Now, some of you are saying, well, wait a minute, what about, really, to pause for just a minute, the only important thing about the earth, when people say we must save the earth, Gaia, our Mother Earth, the only important thing about the earth is a rock. It is a piece of rock floating in the vastness of space, spinning around a star just in the right place to support life. The only thing important about that rock is life. The only thing important about life is human consciousness. Why? Because it gives value to everything. It is the thing that gives value to everything. All right. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a minute, what about God? And that, of course, is exactly the question. When we see these values, when we see the value of another consciousness, are we seeing something that's there, or are we creating that value? Is it just valuable to us? Now, I would say we're just discovering that value. The value is there, but we are discovering it. The reason it's there is because God sees that consciousness as well. Obviously, this professor doesn't think that, because if he saw that the value of the other animal's consciousness was absolute, he would also see that the value of our consciousness is absolute, and the value of the consciousness of generations to come is also absolute, because that also exists in the mind of God. He is reasoning without God. Now, what happens when you reason without God? And because there is a God, and because things only make sense with God who exists, right? When you remove him, in order to reason at all, in order to speak at all, you have to put something back in its place. What does Professor Todd May put in its place? He puts himself. He puts the idea that his reasoning about this, his thinking about this, is somehow important enough so he can destroy anybody who could think the way he thinks and reason the way he reasons. His entire conversation would vanish off the face of the earth. Now, what does this have to do with leftism? For this, I want to turn to another article that was in Quillette by a fellow named Connor Barnes, who was a former anarchist, right? And he talks about what it's like to be in an anarchist community. He says commentators have accurately noted how social justice seems to take the form of a religion, right? When you eliminate God, the world makes no sense. Simply to reason, you have to put something in the place of God. You can put your own conscience. There has to be a consciousness there. You can put your own consciousness. That's what most people do. They put their own consciousness, but you got to put something there. So he says social justice seems to have the form of a religion. This captures the meaning and fulfillment I found, Connor Barnes found, in protests and occupations. It also captures how outside of these harrowing festivals, everyday life in radical communities is mundane but pious. As a radical activist, much of my time was devoted to proselytizing. Non-anarchists were like pagans to be converted through zines and wheat-pasted posters rather than by Bible and baptism. When non-radicals listened to my assertions that Nazis deserved death, that all life had developed into spectacle, and that monogamy was a capitalist social construct, they were probably bewildered instead of enticed. Deep and sincere engagement with opposing points of view is out of the question. You know, last night I had a dear friend over the house, and he's a liberal. We got into a discussion. We found so much in common. We found so much between us that we agreed on, including his dislike and rejection of identity politics, of silencing people, so much that we agreed on, even as we disagreed on who the good politicians were and what the good policies were. But if you're a radical, deep and sincere engagement with opposing points of view is out of the question, says Connor Barnes, because it has replaced God. Radicalism is like a clan, too suspicious of outsiders to abandon cousin marriage, and like incestuous offspring, radicalism's intellectual offspring accumulate genetic load. Escape from the paradigm of suspicion is hindered by Kafka trapping. Okay, and I'm going to come back in a minute and talk about Kafka trapping, because this is something I've noticed. I've actually spoken about it before, but I never had a name for it before, and I love this name from the writer Kafka. But let's just pause for a minute, because Connor Barnes was on with Tucker Carlson and spoke a little bit about what his life was like and where all of this led him. And let's listen to that for a minute.
What was your view of violence?
So violence, there's a shifty way people talk about it. Direct action and diversity of tactics, which is a subtle way of saying, if somebody wants to be violent, we're going to turn our head and be okay with it.
So it's not a nonviolent movement?
No.
Huh. How did you get into it?
I was a pretty unhappy teenager, and I'm told that happens a lot to teenagers, and I went looking for an explanation, and I ended up just reading a lot of radical literature and found more and more radical literature until I found things that explained that happiness wasn't something you had much control over. Capitalism was keeping you down.
So he gets into he got into a circular argument, and the circular argument was based on and worked through this thing, Kafka trapping. Now, I'm sure most of you know who Kafka was. He wrote these really wonderful and excruciating novels, one of them being The Trial, in which a man is charged with something. He's never told what. He's never told how he can address the charge. It's kind of like being investigated by Mueller. You know, the charges come out, and the charge is the charge, and asking about the charge is part of the charge, and you just find yourself in this bureaucracy. And Kafka was predicting and noticing the bureaucracy that was going to become the hell of the 20th and then the 21st century. So Kafka's characters were in this trap. So Kafka trapping is the idea that opposition to a radical viewpoint proves the radical viewpoint. And I'm sure you've heard people say this. An example of this is a woman says, being a feminist just made me miserable. And they say, well, that's because you've been convinced by the patriarchy to be against your own interests, right? So the fact that you are against feminism proves feminism's point, okay? Where does this come from? And Connor Barnes continues and writes about this. There is an overdeveloped muscle in radicalism, the critical reflex. It is able to find oppression behind any mundanity, any normal thing. Where does this critical reflex come from? French philosopher Paul Ricoeur famously coined the term school of suspicion to describe Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud's drive to uncover repressed meaning in text and societies. Today's radicals have inherited this drive by way of Foucault and other Marxo-Nietzscheans. Now, this is wonderful stuff because a lot of it comes from Nietzsche, okay? So let's talk about Nietzsche just for a minute. Nietzsche said that without God, there can be no objective morality. So all that's left is to find what he called the genealogy of morals, where morals come from, to analyze them. The word analyze means to take things apart, okay? So to take apart our morals and examine them and look at them and go back and see where they go, because there is no objective morality without God. Both Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud were dedicated to despiritualizing things that had been spiritualized before. So Karl Marx, not to get too deep in the philosophical weeds, but he said, I'm going to turn Hegel on his head. Hegel wrote a book which is really hard. I read it. It's almost incomprehensible, but it's a book called The Phenomenology of Spirit, on how our spirits develop. Marx took that theory and took the spirit out of it and made it all about money. Going back to feminism, you hear Marx in feminism when they say, oh, women, it's unfair. They don't make as much money when they stay home and take care of the kids, as if money were the only thing life was about, okay? Freud did the same thing with Christianity. Freud took Christianity and he based it all on sex. So instead of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, you had the id, ego, and superego. All the things of Christianity were sort of recreated as based on our erotic impulses. And so again, without God, without the Spirit, there's nothing left to do but analyze, but take things apart. The people who do this today are guys like Jonathan Haidt, Yuval Harari, Steven Pinker, maybe it's Jonathan Haidt, Steven Pinker, and sometimes we like these guys because they say conservative things, but we should be really careful with them because their reasoning is always materialist. It's always, if I take this apart, I get here, I can get here, and if I can create an evolutionary story about this form of morality, then this form of morality is useful. The problem with that is when it becomes useful to kill babies, when it becomes useful to create human beings and just use their body parts for other richer human beings, they will do that as well. Without the idea of the Spirit, without the idea of God setting the rules, you're going to get lost in that world. And it may be fine. It may make everybody happy, and it'll still be an atrocity. Here's the thing. The physical world is infinitely analyzable, infinitely take-apartable. You can take it apart forever. You can break everything down into smaller and smaller bits. And so you can always find some injustice. You can always find something wrong. Oh my God, they're playing Baby It's Cold Outside. Every tradition, every convention, everything that we do. Oh my God, you married a female, a man married a woman and had children. Oh my God, capitalist construct. The fact is, the beaten path in a free society is usually the best path unless it's not, right? The beaten path is there because people chose it again and again. They chose it in a free society because it worked for them, because it was good for them. So following the beaten path is usually the path of wisdom. Now and again, you look up and say, oh, here's a terrible injustice that has to be fixed. Let's leave the beaten path or broaden the beaten path and do something new. Here's a situation that doesn't work anymore. Let's enlarge it. Let's turn the path a little bit. But normally, on a normal day, the beaten path is the right way. This is why leftists are always taking it apart, because they don't believe in the Spirit. The thing about the Spirit is not analyzable. Think of it like this. A car can be taken apart. The experience of driving a car is a whole, right? You can't take anything out of it or it stops. When a car breaks, you have to take it apart and put it back together. When a car is working right, the experience is all you need. Right? You don't need to take the car apart when the car is working properly. Most of the time, the beaten path is working properly. Most of the time, our traditions are in place because people chose those traditions again and again. The car does not need to be taken apart. What the left gets wrong is always a question of spirit. It is always removing the spirit, the wholeness of life from life, and being left with nothing left but materialism. It is again and again. And ultimately, what you come down to is, why live at all? Life itself can be taken apart and analyzed until there's no purpose to it, and the life of an animal is more important than the life of a human being. And this is why in Deuteronomy, God said, I have put before you life and death. Now choose life so that you and your children may live and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life. That's why it says that, okay? And that's why the left is so wrong about this and so wrong about destroying every tradition they can lay their hands on. There's nothing wrong with including new people in our traditions. There's nothing wrong with including new traditions that help out excluded groups. But there is something terribly wrong with disassembling the traditions of the majority that have lasted and served us so well.